What would you do if you discovered the child you never knew existed was living just miles away from you? Picture this. You're Vincent Reed, a billionaire CEO standing in a dimly lit art gallery in downtown Manhattan. Your eyes are locked on a digital portrait that seems to pierce straight through your soul. But it's not the raw emotion of the artwork that's making your hands tremble. It's a tiny symbol buried within the digital layers. A symbol you haven't seen in 6 years. A symbol that was pressed into your palm by a mysterious woman who vanished at dawn, leaving behind only whispered promises and a silver charm. Have you ever had a moment that changed your entire life in ways you couldn't imagine? A single night that created ripples you wouldn't discover for years? Tonight, I'm sharing the incredible true-inspired story of Vincent Reed, a man who thought he had conquered the world, built an empire, and mastered every aspect of his existence. But what happens when destiny reveals a secret that could shatter everything he believed about his life? What happens when a billionaire discovers that the most important deal he ever made wasn't in a boardroom? It was behind velvet curtains at a charity gala, with a woman whose real name he never even knew. This isn't just a story about wealth and power. This is a story about the connections that define us, the secrets that shape us, and the moment when everything you thought you knew gets turned completely upside down. Vincent Reed stood in that gallery, staring at initials that read NC, beneath artwork that contained his family's ancient symbol. At that moment, he faced a choice that would change 2 lives forever. Because sometimes the most powerful person in the room is also the most powerless when it comes to the human heart. But before I tell you about that life-changing gallery moment, you need to understand how we got here. You need to know about a night 6 years earlier that started like a fairy tale and ended like a mystery novel. If stories like this fascinate you, stories about destiny, hidden connections, and the incredible ways life brings people together, hit that like button right now. And let me know in the comments. Have you ever discovered something that completely changed your perspective on your past? Because Vincent Reed was about to discover that his past wasn't what he thought it was. And neither was his future. The year was 2019, and Vincent Reed was living what most people would call the perfect life. But as you're about to learn, perfection can be the loneliest place on earth. Vincent Reed's office occupied the entire top floor of a gleaming Manhattan skyscraper, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the city that never slept. At 35, he had built Reed Technologies from a small startup into a billion-dollar empire specializing in artificial intelligence innovations that were reshaping entire industries. From the outside, Vincent had it all. The penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side, the fleet of luxury cars, the private jet, the kind of wealth that made problems disappear with a single phone call. Business magazines regularly featured him on their covers, calling him a visionary, a disruptor, a man who could see the future before anyone else. But here's what those magazine covers couldn't capture: the deafening silence of his penthouse at 2 a.m. The way he'd stand at his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at millions of people living their lives, and feel completely disconnected from all of it. Picture this scene: Vincent Reed, master of technology, sitting alone in his $50 million penthouse, scrolling through his contacts and realizing he didn't have a single person to call just to talk. Not about business deals or investment opportunities or quarterly projections. Just to talk. His romantic life was a string of relationships that followed the same predictable pattern. Beautiful women who were attracted to his wealth and status. Relationships that started with expensive dinners and exotic vacations, and ended when they realized that beneath the fortune and the fame was a man who had never learned how to truly connect with another human being. Vincent had spent so much time building his empire that he'd forgotten to build a life. His assistant, Margaret, had worked for him for 8 years. She knew his coffee order, his schedule, his preferences better than anyone. But even Margaret kept their relationship strictly professional. She'd watch him work 16-hour days, see him take meetings during family holidays, witness him choose conference calls over social events time and time again. "Mr. Reed," she'd say, "the invitation to the Metropolitan Opera House Gala came in. Should I decline like usual?" For years, the answer had always been yes. Vincent Reed didn't do charity galas. He wrote checks, big ones. But he didn't do small talk with society types who wanted to discuss their latest philanthropic endeavors over champagne and canapes. But something about that particular spring evening in 2019 made him pause. Maybe it was the loneliness that had been growing heavier each day. Maybe it was the realization that he was 35 years old and had never experienced anything that felt remotely like the deep connections he read about in books or saw in movies. Maybe it was the simple human need to be around other people, even if those people were only interested in what his presence could do for their social status. "Actually, Margaret," he said, looking up from his computer screen for the first time that day, "I think I'll attend this one." Margaret's surprise was visible. In 8 years, Vincent had never changed his mind about a social event. "Are you sure, sir? It's not really your usual environment." Vincent smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "Maybe that's exactly why I should go." Little did he know that this single decision would set in motion a chain of events that would redefine everything he thought he knew about family, love, and the connections that make life worth living. The Reed Technologies empire had been built on Vincent's ability to see patterns others missed, to predict technological trends before they became obvious, to make connections between seemingly unrelated pieces of information. But all of his analytical skills, all of his pattern recognition abilities, all of his strategic thinking couldn't have prepared him for what was about to happen. Because some connections can't be predicted or analyzed. Some connections are written in the stars, carved into destiny, and revealed only when the time is exactly right. That charity gala was happening in just 3 days. Vincent had no idea that he was about to meet someone who would vanish from his life as quickly as she appeared, leaving behind only a silver charm and questions that would haunt him for 6 years. But that night would change everything. The Metropolitan Opera House glittered like a jewel against the New York City skyline on that warm May evening in 2019. Vincent Reed adjusted his black tie attire as his driver pulled up to the red carpet entrance, where photographers captured the city's elite arriving for the annual Children's Future Foundation Gala. Vincent had attended business events, board meetings, and investor presentations countless times, but this felt different. The energy was lighter, more social, filled with laughter and conversation rather than the intense focus of corporate gatherings. As he made his way through the grand foyer, accepting handshakes and brief conversations with acquaintances from the business world, Vincent found himself scanning the crowd with an unusual sense of anticipation. He couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was going to be different. And then he saw her. Picture this moment. The grand ballroom filled with New York's most powerful and influential people. Everyone dressed in their finest attire, conversations flowing over champagne and classical music. But in that sea of familiar faces and predictable interactions, one woman stood out like a beacon. She was standing near the silent auction displays, wearing a dress that seemed to capture and reflect light with every movement, sapphire sequins that shimmered like stars against midnight sky. But it wasn't just the dress that caught Vincent's attention. It was the way she carried herself. Confident but not attention-seeking. Elegant but not pretentious. Beautiful but in a way that seemed completely natural and unaffected. The other guests had noticed her too. Vincent could hear fragments of conversation as people passed by. "Who is she? I've never seen her before. Someone said she's in the art world. She's like Cinderella, nobody knows where she came from, but she's absolutely captivating." Vincent found himself walking toward her before he'd made a conscious decision to do so. As he got closer, he could see that she was studying one of the auction pieces, a sculpture created by underprivileged youth from the Bronx. "Beautiful work," he said, stepping up beside her. She turned, and Vincent felt something he'd never experienced before. It wasn't just attraction, though she was undeniably beautiful. It was recognition, as if his soul had been waiting for this exact moment, this exact person, without him even knowing it. "It really is," she replied, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed genuine in a room full of calculated social interactions. "There's so much emotion in it. You can feel the artist's story without knowing a single detail about their life." They talked about art, about the foundation's work with underprivileged children, about the way creativity could transform lives. But beneath their conversation was an undercurrent of connection that neither of them had expected to find at a charity gala surrounded by hundreds of other people. "I'm Vincent," he said, extending his hand. "Delilah," she replied, and when their hands touched, Vincent felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with static and everything to do with destiny. The evening unfolded like something from a movie. They found themselves gravitating toward each other throughout the night, their conversations becoming deeper and more personal as the hours passed. Delilah had a way of asking questions that made Vincent think about things he'd never considered before. Not about business or technology or investments, but about dreams, about what made him feel alive, about the person he was beneath all the success and recognition. But here's what Vincent didn't know. Delilah wasn't just making conversation. She was studying him, learning about him, trying to understand if the man behind the billionaire reputation was someone worth knowing. And here's what made the evening truly magical. For the first time in his adult life, Vincent forgot about everything else. He forgot about Reed Technologies, about quarterly earnings, about the board meeting scheduled for Monday morning. For those few hours, he was just a man talking to a woman who seemed to see him in a way no one ever had before. As the gala began to wind down, Delilah touched his arm gently. "Would you like to see something beautiful?" she asked. She led him through a door that opened onto a secluded balcony overlooking Lincoln Center. The city sprawled out before them, millions of lights creating a tapestry of life and dreams and possibilities. "I come here sometimes," she said softly, "when I need to remember that there's beauty in the world, even when everything feels complicated." Vincent turned to look at her, and in that moment, with the city lights reflecting in her eyes and the spring breeze carrying the faint scent of her perfume, he realized he was falling in love with someone whose last name he didn't even know. What happened next was a conversation that lasted until dawn. They talked about childhood dreams, about the paths their lives had taken, about the difference between success and fulfillment. They shared secrets they'd never told anyone else, hopes they'd kept buried, fears they'd never acknowledged. As the sun began to rise over Manhattan, Delilah reached into her small evening purse and pulled out a silver charm, ancient and beautiful, engraved with a symbol Vincent didn't recognize. "I want you to have this," she said, pressing it into his palm. "It's been in my family for generations. It represents new beginnings." Before Vincent could respond, before he could ask for her number or make plans to see her again, Delilah kissed him softly and whispered, "Some moments are perfect exactly as they are. Don't try to hold on to them too tightly." And then she was gone. Vincent stood on that balcony holding the silver charm, watching the city wake up around him. And for the first time in his life, he understood what people meant when they talked about love at first sight. Before I continue, let me ask, have you ever met someone who left such an impact that you couldn't forget them? Someone who changed your perspective in just a few hours? Share your story in the comments below, because what Vincent didn't know was that this wasn't just a chance encounter. This was destiny setting the stage for a revelation that would come 6 years later. While Vincent Reed returned to his penthouse that morning, clutching a silver charm and replaying every moment of his encounter with the mysterious Delilah, the woman herself was on a bus heading back to Philadelphia, her real life and her real name. Her name wasn't Delilah Quinn. It was Naomi Carlisle, and the elegant woman in sapphire sequins was about to disappear back into a world that existed in stark contrast to the glittering society event she'd just left behind. Naomi lived in a small apartment in North Philadelphia with Ruth Hawkins, the woman who had fostered her since she was 14. Ruth wasn't just a foster parent. She was a force of nature who had taken in dozens of children over the years, providing them with stability, love, and most importantly, the belief that their circumstances didn't have to define their futures. Picture this. Instead of a Manhattan penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows, Naomi's world was a 3-bedroom row house with worn hardwood floors, secondhand furniture that Ruth had carefully refinished, and walls covered with artwork created by all the children who had found refuge there over the years. But here's what made that house special. It was filled with something Vincent's penthouse lacked entirely. It was filled with love, with genuine connection, with the kind of family bonds that aren't based on blood or money, but on choice and commitment, and showing up for each other every single day. Ruth had noticed something different about Naomi when she came home that Sunday morning. The young woman moved through their morning routine, making coffee, checking on Ruth's arthritis medication, reviewing the week's budget, with a distracted air that was completely unlike her usual focused efficiency. "Where did you really go last night, baby girl?" Ruth asked, using the nickname she'd given Naomi years earlier. Naomi had told Ruth she was attending an art event in the city, which was technically true. She just hadn't mentioned that it was a charity gala filled with Manhattan's wealthiest residents, or that she'd spent the night talking to a billionaire CEO who made her feel like she was the only person in the room. "Just an art thing," Naomi replied, but Ruth had raised enough children to recognize evasion when she heard it. The truth was, Naomi had never told anyone about that night. Not Ruth, not her closest friends, not even the journal she'd kept since she was 15. Some experiences were too precious, too fragile, to risk diminishing them by putting them into words. But Naomi kept the memory of that night close to her heart, along with the business card Vincent had given her before she'd slipped away. She never called the number, never reached out, never tried to turn one perfect night into something that might disappoint them both. Instead, she focused on building the life she'd been working toward since she was old enough to understand that her future was entirely up to her. Here's what Vincent never knew. Naomi was brilliant. Not just intelligent, but possessed of the kind of raw creativity and analytical thinking that could have made her successful in any field she chose. She'd earned a full scholarship to the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, where she was studying digital media design with a focus on interactive installations. Her professors regularly told her that her work was graduate level, that she had a perspective and technical skill that set her apart from her peers. But Naomi had learned early in life not to depend on other people's recognition or approval. She worked 2 part-time jobs, one at a coffee shop near campus, another doing freelance graphic design for small businesses, to pay for everything her scholarship didn't cover. Every penny she earned went toward 3 things: helping Ruth with household expenses, saving money for her own apartment after graduation, and purchasing art supplies for the project that had become her obsession. That project was a digital art series exploring identity, family, and belonging. Each piece incorporated symbols and imagery from different cultures and time periods, woven together in ways that asked questions about where we come from and how we define ourselves when the traditional markers of family and heritage aren't available to us. Naomi had been working on this series for 2 years, pouring all of her questions about her own identity into digital canvases that seemed to pulse with life and emotion. She'd never known her biological parents, never had access to the stories and connections that most people took for granted. So she created her own mythology, her own symbols, her own way of understanding who she was and where she belonged in the world. One symbol appeared in every single piece she created, an ancient marking that Ruth had taught her years earlier. Ruth said it represented new beginnings, fresh starts, the idea that every day offered the possibility of rewriting your story. Naomi had no idea that this symbol, carved into a silver charm and passed down through generations, was sitting in a billionaire's penthouse just 90 miles away, held by a man who thought about her every single day but had no way to find her. While Vincent was building his technology empire and attending board meetings and making decisions that affected thousands of employees, Naomi was creating art that would eventually change both of their lives. She was developing a style and perspective that would catch the attention of gallery owners and critics, and eventually, a foundation that supported young artists from underserved communities. But none of that had happened yet. For now, Naomi was just a 20-year-old college student who worked 2 jobs, helped raise foster children, and created digital art that seemed to capture something essential about the human experience of searching for connection and meaning. She thought about Vincent sometimes, about the way he'd listened to her talk about art as if every word mattered, about the gentleness in his eyes when he'd looked at her, about the conversation that had made her feel understood in a way she'd never experienced before. But she also knew that their worlds were too different, their lives too far apart, for that one perfect night to become anything more than a beautiful memory. Little did Naomi know that Vincent was about to receive a full scholarship offer that would bring her to New York City, just miles away from the man who had never stopped looking for the woman who had vanished at dawn, leaving behind only a silver charm and the memory of a connection that had felt like coming home. 6 years passed. 6 years of Vincent Reed building his empire even larger, expanding Reed Technologies into international markets, making Forbes lists, and giving interviews about the future of artificial intelligence. 6 years of success that felt increasingly hollow. 6 years of Naomi Carlisle graduating summa cum laude, winning every art award her university offered, and earning a full scholarship to continue her graduate work in New York City. 6 years of 2 people living parallel lives in the same metropolitan area, never knowing they were breathing the same air, riding the same subway lines, sometimes shopping in the same stores, always carrying pieces of each other without realizing it. Vincent still kept the silver charm on his desk, right next to his computer monitor. His cleaning staff had been instructed never to move it. Colleagues who visited his office sometimes asked about it, but Vincent would just smile and change the subject. How do you explain to people that a piece of jewelry from a woman whose real name you never learned has become your most treasured possession? Meanwhile, Naomi's art had evolved into something extraordinary. Her graduate portfolio was generating attention from gallery owners across the city. Her digital installations, immersive experiences that combine traditional artistic techniques with cutting-edge technology, were being featured in group shows and independent exhibitions throughout Manhattan's art district. But here's what made her work truly special. Every piece told a story about connection, about the invisible threads that bind people together across time and distance and circumstance. Her installations asked viewers to consider their own hidden connections, their own missed opportunities, their own moments of almost meeting that could have changed everything. And in every single piece, woven into the digital layers with such subtlety that most viewers missed it entirely, was that ancient symbol Ruth had taught her years earlier. On a crisp October afternoon in 2025, Vincent made a decision that would change everything. He was reviewing quarterly reports when Margaret knocked on his office door with an unusual request. Mr. Reed, the Reed Foundation received an invitation to sponsor a new exhibition downtown. It's featuring young artists from underserved communities. Exactly the kind of initiative you've been wanting to support more directly. Vincent looked up from his computer screen. The Reed Foundation had been writing checks to various charities for years, but Vincent had never taken an active role in selecting recipients or attending events. He was too busy, too focused on business, too uncomfortable with the social aspects of philanthropy. But something about Margaret's description caught his attention. "Tell me more about it," he said. "It's called Hidden Connections. Art is bridge building." The featured artists are all graduate students who grew up in foster care or other challenging circumstances. Their work explores themes of family, identity, and belonging. The gallery owner says it's some of the most emotionally powerful art she's ever exhibited. Vincent found himself nodding before Margaret had finished speaking. "Let's sponsor it. And Margaret, I'd like to attend the opening reception." Margaret's surprise was obvious, but she'd learned not to question Vincent's decisions. "Of course, sir. The reception is this Friday evening." That Friday evening, Vincent walked into a converted warehouse space in the Lower East Side that had been transformed into a contemporary art gallery. The space buzzed with energy, young artists, art students, gallery owners, and a diverse crowd of people who looked like they actually belonged in this creative environment. Vincent felt completely out of place in his expensive suit among people wearing vintage band t-shirts and paint-stained jeans. But as he began to move through the exhibition, something extraordinary happened. The artwork began to speak to him in a way that expensive paintings in upscale galleries never had. These weren't pretty pictures created to match wealthy people's furniture. These were raw, emotional, honest explorations of what it meant to be human. Each installation seemed to ask the viewer to examine their own life, their own connections, their own understanding of family and belonging. And then Vincent stopped in front of a piece that made his breath catch in his throat. The installation was called Silver Threads. It was a large digital display showing what appeared to be a city at night, with thousands of silver lines connecting different points of light. As viewers watched, the connections would shift and change, showing how the same people could be linked in ways they never realized, how chance encounters could create bonds that lasted lifetimes, how love and family could exist in forms that traditional society never recognized. It was beautiful. It was profound. It was exactly the kind of art that made people stop and think about their own lives in new ways. But what made Vincent's hands tremble as he stared at the piece wasn't the artistic concept or the technical execution. It was the tiny symbol embedded in the lower right corner of the digital display. A symbol he hadn't seen in 6 years, but would recognize anywhere. The same symbol that was engraved on the silver charm sitting on his desk in his office 40 blocks away. Vincent's heart was racing as he looked for the artist's signature. In small, elegant letters at the bottom of the display, NC 2025. He approached the gallery attendant, trying to keep his voice steady. "The artist who created Silver Threads, NC, is she here tonight?" The young woman smiled. "Oh, you mean Naomi Carlisle? She's incredible, isn't she? This piece is already generating so much interest. I think she just stepped out for some air, but she should be back soon." Naomi Carlisle. NC. The same initials, the same symbol, the same city where a woman named Delilah had vanished at dawn 6 years earlier. Vincent Reed, a man who had built his fortune on analyzing patterns and making connections others missed, suddenly realized he was standing in front of evidence that the woman he'd never been able to forget might be closer than he'd ever imagined. This is where the story gets incredible. And I want to know, what would you do in Vincent's position? Would you investigate or let sleeping dogs lie? Let me know in the comments. Because Vincent was about to make a choice that would either answer 6 years of questions or open up mysteries he wasn't prepared to handle. Vincent left the gallery that night with more questions than answers. But for the first time in 6 years, he had a lead. NC Naomi Carlisle, a digital artist whose work featured the same symbol that had been pressed into his palm by a woman who called herself Delilah Quinn. Back in his penthouse, Vincent sat at his desk holding the silver charm, staring at Naomi Carlisle's business card from the gallery, trying to piece together a puzzle that seemed impossible and inevitable at the same time. But Vincent Reed hadn't become a billionaire by ignoring his instincts or letting opportunities slip away. If there was even a possibility that Naomi Carlisle was connected to the woman who had changed his life in a single night, he was going to find out. However, Vincent also understood that this situation required delicacy. He couldn't just call Naomi and ask if she'd ever pretended to be someone named Delilah at a charity gala. He couldn't hire investigators to dig into her personal life without evidence that justified such an intrusion. And he certainly couldn't let his hopes run away with his judgment. So Vincent did what he did best. He approached the situation strategically, methodically, and with the kind of careful analysis that had made Reed Technologies one of the most successful companies in the world. His first step was research. Public records, social media profiles, university databases. Anything that could give him insight into Naomi Carlisle's background without crossing ethical boundaries. What he discovered was fascinating. Naomi had grown up in foster care in Philadelphia, had earned a full scholarship to the University of the Arts, and was now completing her graduate degree at NYU. Her academic record was exceptional. Her artwork was gaining recognition throughout the city, and everyone who knew her described her as talented, hardworking, and completely committed to her art. But here's what Vincent found most interesting. There were gaps in Naomi's social media presence. Periods where she seemed to disappear from online activity entirely. And her artwork consistently featured themes of hidden identity, secret connections, and the idea that people weren't always who they appeared to be on the surface. Vincent's next step was more direct. He arranged for the Reed Foundation to commission a piece from Naomi, a digital installation for the lobby of Reed Technologies headquarters. It was a legitimate business arrangement that would give him the opportunity to meet her, observe her, and hopefully determine if his instincts were correct. The commission was significant, more money than most graduate students could earn in an entire year. Vincent instructed Margaret to handle the initial contact, but he made sure the project description emphasized themes that might resonate with someone who understood the complexity of identity and connection. Naomi's response came within 2 days. She was interested in the commission and would be happy to meet with representatives from Reed Technologies to discuss the project details. Vincent spent the 3 days before their scheduled meeting in a state of anticipation he hadn't experienced since he was a child waiting for Christmas morning. He found himself rehearsing conversations, imagining different scenarios, trying to prepare for the possibility that he was completely wrong about his suspicions. But he also found himself hoping, really hoping, for the first time in years. Meanwhile, Naomi was dealing with her own complex emotions about the Reed Technologies commission. The project represented a major step forward in her career, the kind of high-profile installation that could open doors to opportunities she'd been working toward since college. But there was something about the commission that made her uneasy. Not the work itself. The project description was exactly the kind of challenge she thrived on. It was the name, Reed Technologies. Vincent Reed. She'd kept his business card for 6 years, hidden in a box of mementos from college. She'd never forgotten the conversation that had made her feel understood in a way she'd never experienced before, or the man who had looked at her like she was the most interesting person in the world. But that was 6 years ago, and Naomi had learned to be practical about relationships and opportunities. Successful businessmen didn't maintain connections with struggling art students from foster care backgrounds. That night at the gala had been beautiful, but it belonged to the past. Still, as she prepared her presentation for Reed Technologies, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that some connections refused to stay buried, no matter how much time passed or how different people's lives became. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon at Reed Technologies' Manhattan headquarters. Vincent had arranged to conduct the meeting himself, though he'd told Margaret it was because he wanted to take a more personal interest in the foundation's artistic commissions. On Thursday morning, Vincent stood in front of his bathroom mirror, trying to decide if he was making a mistake. What if Naomi Carlisle was just a talented artist who happened to use a symbol that coincidentally matched his silver charm? What if he was reading connections into coincidences because he wanted so desperately to find the woman who had vanished from his life? But as Vincent adjusted his tie and prepared to leave for the most important meeting of his life, he realized it didn't matter if he was making a mistake. Some opportunities were too important to let pass by, even if pursuing them meant risking disappointment or embarrassment. Because if there was even a chance that Naomi Carlisle was the woman he'd never stopped thinking about, he had to know. The truth was about to be revealed, and both Vincent and Naomi were about to discover that some connections are so powerful they can survive years of separation, different names, and completely different worlds. Thursday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that makes Manhattan feel electric with possibility. Vincent Reed stood at his office window, watching pedestrians navigate the busy streets 40 floors below, trying to calm nerves he hadn't felt since his first major business presentation 15 years earlier. At exactly 2 p.m., Margaret's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Reed, Ms. Carlisle is here for your meeting." Vincent took a deep breath, straightened his tie one final time, and said, "Send her in." The office door opened, and Vincent's world shifted completely. Standing in his doorway was the woman he'd met 6 years earlier at the Metropolitan Opera House. Not someone who looked similar, not someone who reminded him of her. It was her. Older now, more confident, dressed in professional attire instead of sapphire sequins, but unmistakably the same woman who had pressed a silver charm into his palm and vanished at dawn. Naomi stepped into the office, and Vincent watched her face change as recognition dawned. Her professional smile faltered, her eyes widened, and for a moment that felt like an eternity, they simply stared at each other across the space that had separated them for 6 years. "Delilah," Vincent whispered, the name escaping his lips before he could stop it. "Vincent," she replied, and her voice carried the same warmth that had captivated him at the charity gala. The silence that followed was charged with 6 years of questions, 6 years of wondering, 6 years of a connection that had refused to fade despite time and distance and different lives. Finally, Naomi spoke. I should go. This complicates things." "Please don't," Vincent said, stepping toward her. "Please. I've thought about you every single day for 6 years. I've looked for you everywhere. I never knew your real name, never knew how to find you. But I never stopped hoping." Naomi's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for 6 years. "My name is Naomi Carlisle. I used Delilah Quinn that night because I wanted to be someone different for a few hours. Someone who belonged in your world." "Your world?" Vincent shook his head. "Naomi, you were the most real person in that entire room. You were the only person who made me feel like myself instead of just a walking bank account." The conversation that followed was unlike anything either of them had experienced. They talked about the night that had changed both of their lives, about the reasons Naomi had disappeared, about the 6 years they'd spent thinking about each other without knowing how to reconnect. Naomi explained her background, foster care, Ruth, her struggles to build a career in the art world. Vincent talked about his loneliness, his failed relationships, his realization that all of his success meant nothing without genuine human connection. But as they talked, Vincent found himself studying Naomi's face, noticing things he hadn't seen before. The shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw, something about her features that seemed familiar in a way that went beyond their night together. "Naomi," he said carefully, "can you tell me about your family? Your biological family?" Naomi's expression grew guarded. "I don't know anything about them. I was placed in foster care when I was very young. Ruth, my foster mother, is the only family I've ever known." Vincent walked to his desk and picked up the silver charm that had sat there for 6 years. "This symbol," he said, holding it up. "It appears in your artwork. Ruth taught it to you." "Yes." She said it had been passed down in her family for generations. "It represents new beginnings." Naomi looked confused. "Why?" Vincent's heart was racing as he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a folder he'd hoped he would never need. Inside were documents he'd obtained years earlier, during one of his attempts to learn more about his own family history. "Naomi," he said gently, "this symbol isn't just from Ruth's family. It's from my family. It's been passed down through the Reed family for over 200 years. The implications of this statement hung in the air between them like a bridge neither of them was sure they were ready to cross. "I don't understand," Naomi said, but Vincent could see in her eyes that part of her was beginning to understand, even if her mind wasn't ready to accept it. Vincent pulled out more documents: genealogy records, family trees, historical documentation of the symbol's significance in his family's heritage. Naomi, I think we need to consider the possibility that our connection 6 years ago wasn't just coincidental. The next hour was a blur of phone calls to Vincent's legal team, arrangements for discreet DNA testing, and conversations that challenged everything both of them thought they knew about family, destiny, and the reasons people find each other across impossible odds. 3 days later, Vincent Reed sat in his office holding a manila envelope that contained the results of genetic testing that would either confirm his impossible theory or prove that he was desperately grasping at coincidences. His hands trembled as he opened the envelope and read the laboratory report. The words seemed to blur together at first, but then one line became crystal clear. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. Vincent stared at the document, reading it again and again, trying to process information that seemed to defy everything he thought he understood about his life. Naomi Carlisle, the woman he'd met at a charity gala and fallen in love with in a single night, was his daughter. The silver charm she'd pressed into his palm 6 years earlier had been a family heirloom, passed down through generations of Reeds, somehow making its way to Ruth Hawkins and then to the foster daughter she'd raised with love and determination. Vincent's phone rang, interrupting his shock. It was his private investigator with additional information. "Mr. Reed, I've been able to piece together more of Ms. Carlisle's background. Her birth certificate lists her mother as Sarah Reed, no father listed. Sarah Reed died in a car accident when Naomi was 3 years old. Based on the dates and the genetic evidence, it appears Sarah was your sister." Vincent felt the room spinning around him. His sister Sarah had died when Vincent was in college, and he'd never known she'd had a daughter. The family had been fractured by tragedy and poor communication, and somehow a child had been lost in the chaos of grief and legal proceedings. "There's more, sir," the investigator continued. "Ruth Hawkins was Sarah Reed's best friend. When Sarah died, Ruth fought the system to keep Naomi out of institutional care. She became a licensed foster parent specifically so she could raise Sarah's daughter. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place in ways that seemed impossible and inevitable at the same time. Naomi wasn't just any foster child who happened to possess a family heirloom. She was Vincent's niece, his sister's daughter, his own blood family who had been living in poverty while he built his empire. But the most shocking realization was still to come. Vincent pulled up the calendar on his computer and began counting backwards from Naomi's birth date. The timeline was wrong for her to be Sarah's daughter from her known relationships. With growing certainty that felt like ice in his veins, Vincent realized the truth that the DNA test had confirmed, but his mind had been too shocked to process. Naomi wasn't his niece. She was his daughter, Vincent Reed, a man who had spent 6 years fantasizing about finding and reconnecting with a mysterious woman from a charity gala. Had just discovered that the woman he'd never been able to forget was the daughter he'd never known existed. Imagine getting news like this. How would it change everything you thought you knew about your life? Hit subscribe if you want more incredible stories like this one. The room felt like it was closing in around Vincent as he tried to process the magnitude of this revelation. Every assumption he'd made about that night 6 years ago was wrong. The connection he'd felt hadn't been romantic destiny. It had been the biological bond between a father and daughter who had found each other without knowing who they were. But that raised an even more disturbing question. If Naomi was his daughter, who was her mother? Vincent's private investigator had more information. "Mr. Reed, there's something else you need to know. I've been investigating the Delilah Quinn identity that Ms. Carlisle used at the gala. It appears she borrowed the name and credentials from a friend who was supposed to attend, but couldn't make it last minute. But sir, based on the timeline and the genetic evidence, Ms. Carlisle would have been approximately 22 years old that night." The math was simple and horrifying. If Naomi was 22 in 2019, she had been born in 1997. Vincent would have been only 13 years old in 1997, obviously not Naomi's father. Vincent stared at the DNA results again, reading more carefully this time. The report wasn't showing probability of paternity. It was showing close genetic relationship. The laboratory had tested for family connection, not specifically for parent-child relationship. With shaking hands, Vincent called the laboratory directly. "This is Vincent Reed. I need clarification on the genetic testing results you provided for case number 247891. The laboratory technician was professional but clear. "Mr. Reed, The genetic markers indicate a very close family relationship between the two samples. Based on the age difference you provided, the most likely relationship would be uncle-niece, though father-daughter is also genetically possible if there were unusual circumstances regarding the ages. Vincent hung up the phone and sat in silence, trying to reconstruct everything he thought he knew about his family history. His sister Sarah had died in a car accident when Naomi was 3, but what if Sarah hadn't been Naomi's mother? What if there was another explanation for how a Reed family heirloom had made its way to a foster child in Philadelphia? Vincent spent the next 2 hours making phone calls to distant relatives, digging through family records he hadn't looked at in years, and slowly piecing together a family history that was more complicated than he'd ever realized. The truth, when it finally emerged, was both simpler and more complex than anything he'd imagined. Naomi was his daughter, but not in the way the timeline suggested. Vincent's father had had an affair late in life, after Vincent's mother had passed away. Naomi was Vincent's half-sister, born when Vincent was already an adult building his business empire. The family had covered up the scandal, and when Vincent's father died shortly after Naomi's birth, she had been placed with Sarah Reed, Vincent's sister, who had then passed the child to her best friend Ruth when Sarah herself died in the car accident. Vincent Reed stared out his office window at the Manhattan skyline, trying to process the fact that he had spent 6 years obsessing over a woman who was actually his half-sister. The connection he'd felt hadn't been romantic attraction. It had been the recognition of family, the biological pull between siblings who had been separated by circumstances beyond their control. But this revelation created an even more complex emotional situation. Vincent had built a fantasy around finding and reconnecting with Delilah/Naomi as a romantic partner. Now he had to reconstruct his entire understanding of their relationship and figure out how to tell a young woman that the successful businessman she'd met at a charity gala was actually her half-brother. The story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Vincent knew he couldn't handle this revelation alone. The next morning, he called Naomi and asked if they could meet again, but this time somewhere private and comfortable rather than in his intimidating corporate office. "There's something important we need to discuss," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Something about your family history that I think you deserve to know." They agreed to meet at a small cafe in Greenwich Village, far from the corporate environment of Reed Technologies and the art world environment of Naomi's usual haunts. Neutral territory where they could have a conversation that was going to change both of their lives. Vincent arrived first and chose a corner table where they could talk privately. When Naomi walked through the cafe door, he felt the same sense of recognition he'd experienced 6 years earlier. But now it made sense in a completely different way. The familiarity wasn't romantic chemistry. It was the genetic recognition between family members who shared the same eyes, the same stubborn set to their jaw, the same unconscious gestures when they were thinking. "Vincent," Naomi said as she sat down across from him, "you look like you haven't slept in days." "I haven't," he admitted. "Naomi, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible. But I have documentation, genetic testing, and private investigator reports that confirm everything I'm going to share with you." Over the next hour, Vincent carefully explained what he'd discovered. He showed Naomi the DNA results, the family records, the timeline that revealed she was his half-sister rather than a romantic connection from his past. Naomi listened in stunned silence, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just trying to process information that challenged everything she thought she knew about her identity and origins. "So Ruth knew?" Naomi finally asked. "Ruth knew who my father was, knew I had a brother who was building a business empire, and never told me?" Vincent nodded. "I think Ruth was protecting you, and probably protecting our father's memory as well. From what I can piece together, our father made Ruth promise never to contact our family. He was ashamed of the affair, ashamed of having a child out of wedlock so late in life, and he thought you'd be better off not knowing about the family money and complications." Naomi stared at her coffee cup, tears streaming down her face. "I've spent my entire life wondering where I came from, wondering if I had any biological family out there, wondering why I was abandoned. And all this time, I had a brother who was..." She gestured vaguely at Vincent's expensive suit, his obvious wealth. "Who was living like this." "Naomi," Vincent said gently, "I didn't know. If I had known, everything would have been different. You would have grown up with every advantage, every opportunity. You never would have struggled or worried about money or felt abandoned. But would I have become who I am?" Naomi asked, looking directly at him for the first time since he'd started explaining. If I'd grown up with wealth and privilege, would I have developed the same drive, the same perspective, the same understanding of what it means to fight for everything you achieve? It was a question Vincent couldn't answer, but it revealed something important about his sister. She wasn't bitter about the life she'd lived. She was proud of what she'd accomplished, proud of the woman Ruth had helped her become. What happens now? Naomi asked. Vincent had been thinking about this question for 3 sleepless nights. That's entirely up to you, he said. I can't undo the years we lost, can't change the fact that you grew up without knowing you had family. But I can tell you that finding you, learning that you're my sister, is the best thing that's happened to me in years. Naomi was quiet for a long time, processing everything Vincent had told her and trying to decide how she felt about suddenly having a billionaire brother who wanted to be part of her life. I need time, she finally said. It's overwhelming. I need to talk to Ruth, need to understand why she made the choices she made. And I need to figure out how to reconcile the person I've always been with this new information about where I came from. Vincent nodded. Take all the time you need. But Naomi, I want you to know, whatever you decide about our relationship going forward, you're not alone anymore. You have family. You have someone who cares about what happens to you. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Naomi turned to Vincent with a question that had been haunting her since he'd started his explanation. Vincent, that night at the charity gala, did you feel something? Some kind of connection that you couldn't explain. Vincent smiled sadly. I thought it was love at first sight. Turns out, it was just biology recognizing biology. Family finding family, even when we didn't know that's what was happening. Maybe that's what love at first sight really is, Naomi said. Maybe it's just souls recognizing each other, regardless of the relationship that's meant to connect them. They parted that day with more questions than answers, but for the first time in both of their lives, they weren't facing those questions alone. The weeks that followed were a careful dance of 2 people learning how to be family without any roadmap for their unusual situation. Vincent and Naomi began meeting regularly, not in corporate boardrooms or art galleries, but in coffee shops and parks and quiet restaurants where they could focus on getting to know each other as people rather than as CEO and artist. Their first real breakthrough came during a visit to Ruth in Philadelphia. Vincent had insisted on making the trip, despite his nervousness about meeting the woman who had raised his sister when his family had failed to do so. Ruth Hawkins turned out to be everything Vincent had hoped she would be: warm, wise, and completely devoted to Naomi's well-being. But she also had stories to tell about Vincent's father that helped both siblings understand the complex circumstances that had led to their separation. Your daddy was a good man who made some complicated choices, Ruth told Vincent as they sat in her small living room surrounded by decades of family photos that included pictures of Naomi growing up. He was grieving your mother, struggling with his business, and feeling guilty about the relationship that led to Naomi's birth. He thought the kindest thing he could do was make sure she had a stable, loving home without the complications of family money and expectations. But that wasn't his choice to make, Vincent said, struggling with anger toward a man who had died years earlier. No, it wasn't, Ruth agreed. But people make the best decisions they can with the information and emotional resources they have at the time. Your daddy was scared, Vincent. Scared that bringing Naomi into your world would hurt her more than help her. Naomi had been quiet during most of this conversation, but now she spoke up. Was he wrong? It was the question that had been haunting both Vincent and Naomi since they'd learned the truth about their relationship. Would Naomi have been better off growing up with wealth and privilege? Or had the struggles she'd faced made her into the remarkable woman she'd become? I don't know, baby girl, Ruth said honestly. But I know that you turned out exactly the way you were supposed to turn out. Strong, talented, compassionate, and determined to make the world better through your art. Money might have made your path easier, but it wouldn't have made your destination any more beautiful. That conversation marked a turning point in Vincent and Naomi's relationship. They stopped focusing on what they'd lost and started focusing on what they could build together. Vincent began attending Naomi's art exhibitions, not as a wealthy patron or potential client, but as a proud brother who wanted to support his sister's career. Naomi began visiting Vincent at Reed Technologies, offering insights about creativity and innovation that helped him see his business from new perspectives. Their relationship wasn't without challenges. Vincent had to learn how to be a brother without being overwhelming or controlling. He wanted to solve all of Naomi's problems with money, to make up for lost time by giving her everything she'd never had. But Naomi helped him understand that she didn't need rescuing. She needed partnership. Naomi had to navigate her own complex feelings about suddenly having access to resources and connections that could transform her career. She was proud of what she'd accomplished on her own, and she didn't want her future success to be attributed to family connections rather than talent and hard work. They found their balance by focusing on shared interests rather than past regrets or future complications. Vincent discovered that he genuinely loved Naomi's art, not because she was his sister, but because her work challenged him to think about human connection in ways he'd never considered. Naomi found that Vincent's business acumen and technological expertise could enhance her artistic vision without compromising her creative integrity. 6 months after their reunion, they embarked on their first major collaboration, a digital art installation for Reed Technologies that would showcase the intersection of technology and human creativity. The project became a symbol of their relationship, two different worlds coming together to create something neither could have achieved alone. But perhaps the most meaningful moment in their developing relationship came during a quiet Sunday dinner at Ruth's house. Vincent was helping with dishes while Naomi and Ruth looked through old photo albums, and Ruth made an observation that would stay with Vincent for the rest of his life. "You know what I love about watching you two together?" Ruth said. "You laugh the same way. You've got the same laugh as your sister, Vincent. That's genetics right there, something that money can't buy and circumstances can't change." Vincent paused in his dishwashing and listened to Naomi laughing at something in one of the photo albums. Ruth was right. It was exactly the same laugh he heard every time he looked in the mirror and found something genuinely funny. For the first time since learning the truth about their relationship, Vincent felt truly grateful for the path that had led them to each other. Not sorry about the lost years or angry about the circumstances that had kept them apart, but genuinely grateful that they had found each other despite impossible odds. Some connections, he realized, are strong enough to survive anything. Even years of separation, mistaken identities, and the kind of coincidences that seem too incredible to be true. 1 year after Vincent Reed walked into that art gallery and recognized a symbol that would change his life, he stood in the same space for the opening of Naomi's first solo exhibition. The gallery was packed with art collectors, critics, and supporters who had come to see work that was being hailed as revolutionary in its exploration of family, identity, and human connection. But Vincent wasn't paying attention to the critical acclaim or the potential sales figures. He was watching his sister move through the crowd, confident and gracious, sharing the stories behind her artwork with people who understood that they were experiencing something special. The centerpiece of the exhibition was an installation called Silver Threads Reunited, an evolution of the piece that had first caught Vincent's attention. This new version showed the same city at night, the same silver connections between points of light, but now the connections formed recognizable patterns. Families finding each other across impossible odds, love taking forms that defied conventional definitions, and the way human bonds could survive any circumstance. In the corner of the installation, larger now and impossible to miss, was the ancient Reed family symbol that had brought them together. "Amazing work," said a gallery visitor standing next to Vincent. "The artist must have an incredible personal story to create art this emotionally powerful." Vincent smiled. "She does. But the most amazing thing about her story is that it's still being written." As the evening wound down and the crowd began to thin, Vincent and Naomi found themselves standing together in front of Silver Threads Reunited, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Vincent," Naomi said quietly, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't attended that charity gala 6 years ago? If you'd followed your usual pattern and stayed home?" Vincent considered the question. "Sometimes. But then I remember that we found each other anyway. Maybe it would have taken longer, maybe it would have happened differently, but I think we were always meant to find each other." "Destiny?" Naomi asked with a slight smile. "Family," Vincent replied, which might be the same thing. Their relationship had evolved into something neither of them could have predicted when Vincent first recognized that ancient symbol in a digital art piece. They weren't trying to recreate a traditional brother-sister relationship or make up for lost time. Instead, they had created something entirely their own, a partnership that honored both of their independent lives while acknowledging the deep connection between them. Vincent had learned that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars or business success, but in the quality of relationships and the depth of human connection. His relationship with Naomi had changed his approach to everything. his business, his philanthropy, his understanding of what made life meaningful. Naomi had discovered that family could be chosen as well as biological, that wealth could be a tool for positive change rather than just personal comfort, and that her art could reach even more people when combined with resources and platforms she'd never had access to before. Together, they had established the Reed Carlisle Foundation, which supported young artists from underserved communities and funded programs that helped foster children explore creative careers. Ruth served on the board of directors, bringing decades of experience working with young people who needed guidance and support to reach their potential. But perhaps the most important lesson from their story wasn't about family or wealth or artistic success. It was about the power of persistence and hope. Vincent had kept that silver charm on his desk for 6 years, never giving up on the possibility that it might somehow lead him back to the woman who had changed his life. Naomi had continued incorporating that ancient symbol into her artwork, never knowing it was calling out to family she didn't know existed. Both of them had maintained faith that their connection meant something, even when logic suggested they should move on and forget about a single night that seemed too perfect to be real. Their story became a reminder that some connections transcend circumstance, that family can be found in the most unexpected places, and that the most important relationships in our lives might be closer than we realize. 6 months after Naomi's solo exhibition, Vincent received a phone call that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. It was from a young man named Marcus who had been in foster care for most of his life and was now attending college on a Reed Carlisle Foundation scholarship. "Mr. Reed," Marcus said, "I wanted to thank you for the scholarship, but that's not really why I'm calling. I'm calling because I've been working on a research project about family genealogy, and I discovered something interesting. I think I might be related to you." Vincent smiled as he listened to Marcus explain his research, thinking about the conversation he was going to have with Naomi about how to handle yet another unexpected family connection. Some families, he was learning, are built on more than just biology or legal documents. Some families are built on the recognition that people belong together, regardless of how they find each other. As Vincent ended the call with Marcus and made plans to meet the following week, he realized that his story with Naomi wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. They had found each other against impossible odds, and in doing so, they had learned how to find and create family connections that would last for generations. What did you think of Vincent and Naomi's story? Have you ever had to rebuild a relationship from scratch, or discovered family connections you never knew existed? Share your thoughts below, and if this story moved you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes the most important people in our lives are the ones we haven't met yet. Sometimes family means more than genetics or legal definitions. And sometimes, the silver threads that connect us to the people we're meant to love are stronger than time, distance, or any circumstance that tries to keep us apart. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true-inspired stories about the connections that define us, the love that finds us, and the families we create when we're brave enough to believe that everyone deserves to belong somewhere. Because at the end of the day, we're all looking for the same thing. Someone who sees us, understands us, and chooses to love us exactly as we are. Vincent and Naomi found that in each other, and their story is proof that it's never too late to find your people. The silver threads that connect us all are stronger than we know.